This is Ethics, Lecture 8 on Nietzsche and Camus. Friedrich Nietzsche is a German philosopher of the 19th century, and many people know of Nietzsche through various controversial associations. And there are three in particular that I want to start with to talk about as a way of kind of introducing Nietzsche and also dispelling some myths and misinformation about Nietzsche's legacy and his history. And after we go through Nietzsche, we'll then discuss Camus, who was very influenced by Nietzsche's philosophy. Now, in the normal class, I spend two and a half weeks on both Nietzsche and Camus, so going to get a kind of a crash course on both Nietzsche and Camus, but this will be probably the longest of the 8 lectures. So on to Nietzsche and the 3 issues that have been seen as somewhat controversial. The first is that Nietzsche had a mental breakdown. And so some people will think, well, Nietzsche's insane. And in fact, he did have a mental breakdown in 1889. And people look at what he wrote and some of the controversial things he said. And one conclusion that some scholars have made is that Nietzsche's writings were the writings of a madman and therefore aren't to be taken seriously. For example, not too long before his collapse in the fall of 1888, Nietzsche wrote a book called Ecce Homo. And in this book, he has chapter titles such as Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books, and Why I Am Destiny. Now, on the one hand, if you see those chapter titles, you think, yep, he was going crazy. That's the rantings of a madman, and so you might not take Ecce Homo very seriously, and you might even generalize from that and not take much of the rest of his writings seriously either. But there's at least 2 points to make about this. The first is that Nietzsche's early writings in the 1860s and 70s were highly regarded. Nietzsche was appointed full professor at the age of 24, which was unheard of even then. And the second and even more important point is that one of the themes that was important in his early work when he was a renowned lecturer and highly regarded and respected, one of those themes remains consistent and in fact is the best way to understand the chapter titles of Ecce Homo. And that is the distinction that Nietzsche makes between being selfless and self-full. So if you recall those chapter titles, Why I Write Such Good Books, etc., then clearly one would say that he's being full of himself. And that's exactly the point. And the point here, as Nietzsche would point out, is that our values and our ethics are reflected in our judgments. And many of our values and ethics are automatic. We don't sit and think about our ethics. We simply respond out of habit or custom or tradition. This is a sense in which Nietzsche is similar to what we were talking about with Hume. Our ethics isn't a result of a rational figuring things out, a rational deliberation and calculation and so on. Our values and ethics are to a large extent a part of cultural custom, habit, and tradition. And Nietzsche's main argument is that the tradition that stems from Judeo-Christian values is one that promotes selflessness, not self-fullness. And the master morality that he's going to talk about is going to be one that promotes self-fullness. And what Nietzsche will argue is that selflessness is actually leads to a kind of denial of life. If you think, why are you taking this class? Or why are you doing the things you need to do? Well, it's because you're trying to make yourself more of a person, to make yourself capable of thriving. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche gives an example of when one should or should not have a child. One should not have a child if they need that child to fill them up. In other words, if they have not been successful in their life and they want the child to vicariously become the success they weren't able to become. That's having a child from a perspective of selflessness. And if one has a child simply because they want to allow this child to become the person that they want to be or can be, and don't need that child to fill them up. That would be having a child from self-fullness. The selflessness perspective isn't fair to the child because it's forcing them to be something they may not necessarily want or need to be. So selflessness is, according to Nietzsche, the dominant sort of ethic of the tradition in which he was living and writing about. And it's evidenced by one's automatic reaction to the chapter titles of Ecce Homo. If you immediately have a negative reaction to hearing those chapter titles, that is evidence for Nietzsche of a value or standard that promotes selflessness as a virtue and self-fullness as a vice. And it's exactly the reverse of how it should be. And so even the chapter titles written not long before his mental breakdown do reflect an important philosophical point that was consistent throughout much of Nietzsche's writings. So this is the first of the three issues that is often pointed to as a reason not to take Nietzsche seriously. The second is his famous statement, God is dead. He says this in a number of places, but Thus Spoke Zarathustra is again the most famous place where Nietzsche says this. Now, it may very well be a controversial thing to say, and one might think that he's just ranting and raving and has no real reason to say this other than to get people pissed off. And now, there may very well be some truth to that, and certainly, even in today's age, you may not want to go into a church on a Sunday and start yelling at the top of your voice how God is dead and we have killed him and so on. But there is a very philosophical and sociological justification for what Nietzsche is arguing. In particular, he argues that since the rise of science, we have turned less and less to religion and God to help make sense of our place in the world and the world itself. As you'll probably know, during much of the Middle Ages and up until the 16th century, religious figures were the most educated in Western Europe. And so they were the ones to go to whenever something mysterious or unexplained would happen. And they may have an explanation, but if not, they could always say, God knows. So there was always a kind of a centering upon God and religion in terms of orienting oneself in the world. With the rise of science, Western Europe became increasingly secular and turned more and more towards scientific explanation or naturalistic explanations for phenomena rather than religious explanations. And one example is in the late 1600s, there was a big debate about whether a comet is a divine sign or not, which is not a debate we would even consider having today. And so this is an example of this sort of move away from religion and more towards science. So in a sense, and when Nietzsche says God is dead, it's in the same way as saying God, like Latin, is dead. It's just as Latin is no longer a living language. It's kind of a relic of the past. So to God, as Nietzsche understands it, has become sort of a relic of the past. And it says that we no longer use God as part of our living, making sense of the world approach. So even the God is dead statement has a number of explanations for it that, on the one hand, don't seem to be extremely controversial. Now, this is not to say, and in a longer lecture we would talk about this. It does not mean that Nietzsche is anti-religious or anti-spiritual. He is not. He will be critical of the slave morality he finds within Christianity, and we will talk about that in a few minutes. But unto the third area that has often been kind of saddled Nietzsche with controversy and was, in fact, a reason for people only coming to study and even think about Nietzsche until the 1950s and 60s, and that is the association of Nietzsche with Nazism. And it is true that Nietzsche was considered the philosopher of the Third Reich. His philosophy of the Übermensch, his philosophy of will to power, and his glorification of strength and the fact that he was German from Prussia. All these were, for Hitler and his regime, seen as a perfect fit for his view and vision of the world as he wanted to create it through the Third Reich and then eventually World War II and so on. And so Nietzsche became the sort of the official philosopher of the Nazi Party. And I've had until fairly recently people will go, "Oh, he was the Nazi, wasn't he?" when thinking or referring to Nietzsche. Well, on the one hand, we can clearly say that he wasn't a Nazi philosopher because he died in 1900. Nietzsche died in 1900, and his mental collapse, as you'll recall, was in 1889, which was, I think, Hitler was probably a baby in 1889, if he was born at all. So Nietzsche was not around at the time to either accept or challenge his being appropriated by the Nazis as the official Nazi philosopher. So how did he get to become the official Nazi philosopher? Well, the main person to blame for this is Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth Nietzsche. She was very anti-Semitic and, in fact, had left Germany with her husband because her husband had gotten into trouble with the law after beating up some Jews with a pipe, and he decided to strike a plea bargain and flee the country rather than stay in Germany and serve jail time. Well, he established a German colony in Paraguay called Nueva Germania with a number of his anti-Semitic friends, and actually it's still there. And you can Google a documentary, Nietzsche's Lost Fatherland, or Lost Homeland, and I don't know if you can watch it online or not, but it talks about the history of this community that was established in the jungles of Paraguay in order to preserve the purity of German culture and protect it from the infiltration of Jewish culture and Jews. And so Nietzsche's sister was very much anti-Semitic. And in fact, after the World War II, scholars went to look at the Nietzsche archives and recovered some of his letters and then also uncovered some letters that friends of Nietzsche had received. And when Nietzsche's sister left Paraguay with her husband, he had written to a friend, "Good riddance, that's one less anti-Semite to spoil German soil." And there's passages from Beyond Good and Evil that also are clearly indicative that Nietzsche was not anti-Semitic. And in fact, if anything, he saw that German anti-Semitism was a sign of German weakness and trying to scapegoat someone for their weakness, and the Jews were the handy scapegoat. But when Nietzsche had his mental breakdown, Nietzsche's sister decided to come back to Germany to take care of her brother. Her husband had committed suicide while in the jungles. Apparently that didn't work out well for him. And so she was there alone, and apparently she wasn't too happy being in the jungles either. And so she came back to take care of her brother, Nietzsche. And his fame was on the rise, too, during the 1890s. And she saw dollar signs, I'm sure, and began to take control of his unpublished writings. And it was the unpublished writings that she edited together, published as Will to Power, and sent a copy off to Mussolini saying that Nietzsche's philosophy justified his party and his policies in Italy. And it was Mussolini who told this to Hitler, and that's how Nietzsche became associated with the Nazi Party. And in fact, when Elizabeth Nietzsche died in like 1931 or 2, she was given a state funeral, and Hitler came and put a wreath at her grave. But as we'll see, the whole basis for the success of Nazism and the final solution and so on hinges upon a slave morality, and it's that Nietzsche was very critical of. So in many, many ways, Nazism is not something that Nietzsche would have been in support of, and he himself was aware that his writings would probably be misread and lead to problems. So just by going through these three controversial or at times controversial points regarding Nietzsche. The notion that he had this mental breakdown, the fact that he says God is dead, and the connection with Nazism. We've already begun to see some of the points and philosophies that are important to Nietzsche. So now I want to actually turn to the text, to our reading. And the main notion is, as I've already mentioned, the notion of will to power. And in section 259 of Beyond Good and Evil, it's probably the very first section of your textbook. It's been this way through multiple editions of this text. I want to read that section because this has a tremendous amount of stuff in it. And so this is section 259 from Beyond Good and Evil. To refrain from injuring, abusing, or exploiting one another, to equate another person's will with our own, in a certain crude sense, this can develop into good manners between individuals if the preconditions are in place. That is, if the individuals have truly similar strength and standards, if they are united within one single social body. But if we were to try to take this principle further, and possibly even make it the basic principle of society, it would immediately be revealed for what it is, a will to deny life, a principle for dissolution and decline. We must think through the reasons for this and resist all sentimental frailty. Life itself, in its essence, means appropriating, injuring, overpowering those who are foreign and weaker, oppression, harshness, forcing one's own forms on others, incorporation, and at the very least, at the very mildest, exploitation. But why should we keep using this kind of language that has from time immemorial been infused with a slanderous intent? So the idea here then is that these attributes, these characteristics of incorporation, exploitation, overpowering, injuring, taking advantage of the weaker, etc., all those characteristics have a slanderous intent, as he says. In other words, we take those as a negative, as not being good. And yet, and this is precisely Nietzsche's point as he goes on in the last bit of this paragraph, he says, exploitation is not part of a decadent or imperfect primitive society. It is part of the fundamental nature of living things, as its fundamental organic function. It is a consequence of the true will to power, which is simply the will to life. So let's stick with exploitation. I would sketch up all the other terms in that paragraph as well on the board in a class and go through them one by one, but we can, for the sake of time, just look at exploitation. If you are a math major in college, that's no doubt because you're good at math, and so it would be good to be a math major and to pursue math. Why? Because you're exploiting your strengths and for your own self. So we have both self-fullness and exploitation of one's strengths so that you can have an advantage over those who don't have those strengths and haven't exploited whatever advantages that they can get, whether this be college and so on and so forth. And take a business, whether it's a Walmart or an Apple or whatever the business may be, they also try to exploit their capital advantages and strengths in order to take or capture market share. And this isn't because businesses are evil, it's simply because that's what a growing, thriving business strives to do. It strives to grow, prosper, thrive. So another way of thinking about will to power or will to life is the will to thrive. And along the lines of doing that, one needs to exploit one's strengths, take advantage of that which is weaker, to cause injury to those that stand in the way. It sounds cruel and harsh, but Nietzsche's point is that this is precisely life itself. Life itself is exploitation of one's own strengths in order to thrive. Now, one way to think about this, though, is that if one is truly thriving and strong, they don't need to harm people who are weaker or less than them. That's not something that one would want to do. And so strength is also a psychological strength too. One doesn't necessarily have to have manual or physical control or domination over another. We're talking about various forms of strength for Nietzsche. And yet, as he goes on and on to say that this is a fundamental aspect of nature and of life, the fact of the matter is that these terms have a negative connotation for the most part. And as a result of that negative connotation, they are seen more as a vice and discouraged. But what Nietzsche's point is that precisely because they're being discouraged, we have a denial of life. And this denial of life is simply a denial of the fact that will to power, as I had read, which is simply the will to life. So this desire to thrive and the necessity of exploitation, etc., as part of this will to life, is being denied by a set of values, which Nietzsche will call slave morality, that discourages the types of characteristics that are good for life, that are natural. And that leads me then to the next major theme of Nietzsche, which is the distinction between master and slave morality. And I'll turn to section 260 of the text, which is where he lays out this distinction. And Nietzsche says, while perusing the many subtler and cruder moral codes that have prevailed or still prevail on earth thus far, I found that certain traits regularly recurred in combination, linked to one another, until finally two basic types were revealed and a fundamental difference leaped out at me. There are master moralities and slave moralities. I would add at once that in all higher and more complex cultures, there are also apparent attempts to mediate between the two moralities, and even more often a confusion of the two and a mutual misunderstanding. Indeed, sometimes even their violent juxtaposition, even in the same person within one single breast. Moral value distinctions have emerged either from among a masterful kind, pleasantly aware of how it differed from those whom it mastered, or else from among the mastered, those who were to varying degrees slaves or dependents. So the idea here is fairly straightforward to Nietzsche. We tend to look at life and value life based upon how we situate ourselves and how our situation is with respect to life. So if we're in a position of strength and used to being in a position of strength and dominance and control, then our values will reflect that. If we're in a position of weakness, oppression, and slavery, our values will reflect that. Another way of thinking about this, without kind of layering it with all the cultural and historical traditions that Nietzsche will, and we'll talk about in a second, is to think about how one would look at the world if one were in a great mood, feeling really good about oneself, and how one would look at the world if one was not feeling really good about oneself. If you've had a really terrible day and a lot of bad things have happened, and you're just kind of feeling rather weak and downtrodden and just kind of overwhelmed, you're not likely going to handle some unexpected situation that comes up. And you may not look very well upon your life or on life in general if you're having this perspective. But if you're coming from the perspective of strength and you've had a great day and you're feeling really good about yourself, you're more likely going to have a much more positive attitude. And so that's the point for Nietzsche, is that life itself, by nature, strives towards strength, towards power, towards thriving. Those living organisms do not naturally want to be weak. Life tries to exploit its advantages and strengths and niches in order to perpetuate its strength. So master morality is going to be the set of values that arises from a position of strength, and slave morality is going to be the set of values that arise from a position of weakness. And the core distinction in terms of the values that arise between master and slave morality is going to be that between the good and bad distinction and the good and evil distinction. Now, good and evil is going to be what's associated with slave morality, and it's precisely that Nietzsche wants to move beyond. Hence the title of one of Nietzsche's more famous books, Beyond Good and Evil. And the good and bad distinction is a distinction associated with master morality. So let me explain this. And Nietzsche does talk about this in the continuation of Section 260 as well, which I won't read, but you should read for your own purposes in order to be prepared for other assignments associated with this course. But put simply, for every person, there are strengths and weaknesses. And weaknesses are bad and strengths are good. And we should exploit our strengths and try to minimize our weaknesses. And it's as simple as that. And so from Nietzsche's perspective, the bad are, as he sees it, just sort of those lacking in strength, power, ability to do things, so on and so forth. But the bad, whether it's in oneself or found in another, is generally not a threat to one. If one's truly in a position of strength, they aren't threatened by someone else, especially if they're weaker. Whereas the good-evil distinction arises from someone who's coming from a position of weakness, so they are much more likely threatened. And what are they going to be threatened by? They're going to be threatened precisely by the strength of the master morality, right? Because the people who are strong and dominant and exploiting their strengths and advantages and thriving, they're going to be self-affirming. And they're going to say, it's good to be strong, it's good to be dominant. And so if you look at the history of Rome and the relationship between the Romans and the Christians, the Romans were in the position of strength. They were the ones that were in dominance and control. And so you could say that from that perspective, the Romans had master morality at that point. The Christians, however, were in the position of slavery, dependency, and weakness. And if you think about who did Moses go to free from Egypt, they were slaves. And so there was this long-standing tradition of being oppressed by more powerful neighbors, whether it's Hittites, Egyptians, and then Romans in the time of Jesus. Rather than simply deny that they were weak, what they did, and this is what Nietzsche argues is the interesting reversal, is that they made their weakness a virtue. The fact that they were in a position of weakness made them the chosen people, and by acting from a position of weakness, humility, selflessness, and so on, they could ultimately gain strength in the end. But the trick here, and this was Nietzsche's point, that this strength in the end is acquired in the afterlife. Not in this life, but in the afterlife. And a consequence of this is the good and evil distinction, because the evil becomes characterized with what master morality would have called good, being strong, self-full, exploiting strengths, and so on and so forth. Whereas being what would be good in slave morality is what was bad in master morality, being weak, meek, humble, selfless. Those become virtues. And the reason it's evil rather than bad is precisely because the strength of the master morality is a threat to those who are weaker. And so this is in a kind of a nutshell, the sort of the master-slave morality distinction. And you can kind of see already, based on what I have put out, where this would come in as a sort of critique of Christianity. And as Nietzsche says in the reading, he says, the sickly constitute the greatest danger to man. And it's the greatest danger because what Nietzsche is concerned about, and as he's writing the 1880s, is that the dominance of slave morality, if you'll recall the reaction to the chapter titles of Ecce Homo, why I'm so wise, why I'm so clever, etc., or the negative reaction to terms like exploitation and so on. The dominant values of the time, even though it's a secular age, still reflect a slave morality. In other words, a morality that's based upon a sickly, weakened, life-denying set of values. And that's going to make it even harder to encourage the type of effort and the type of thriving that is going to be better for human beings in the long run. So in many ways, what Nietzsche's doing is trying to critique the values the dominant values of the late 19th century. In many ways, he calls for a transvaluation of values, as he puts it. In other words, our ability to come up with a new set of ethics or values for the modern age. And one of his biggest fears is that the nihilism that we have in the 19th century was becoming dominant. In other words, one of the consequences of slave morality is that one is encouraged to follow the will of another. That was, and basically Nietzsche's concern is that we are losing the will to will itself. In other words, we are no longer having the will to will on our own, so we very quickly and easily follow the will of another. Now, during the period of Christianity, this was a virtue, following God's will, acting on God's will, thy will be done, etc. But in this era of the death of God, right, this secular era where people don't go to church and so on, that habit, that tradition and value is still very much in place. One should be humble, selfless, and put one's own will aside to follow someone else. And this leads them to one of the other concerns that Nietzsche had, is that one's ethics or values are only as important or as meaningful as one's responsibility to follow them is. And Nietzsche's concern is that the dominance of slave morality was leading to the result that more and more people were not taking responsibility for their values. And so it doesn't really matter what you say your ethics is. If you are habituated to a type of slave morality, there's a good chance you won't follow your values. And it's precisely this type of slave morality that probably accounts for why many, many people collaborated with and made possible the final solution in Holocaust that occurred during World War II. And in fact, Nietzsche predicted a lot of great bloodshed and Holocaust-type genocidal conflicts in the 20th century as a result of the dominance of slave morality. Now, on my course website for Philosophy 313, you'll notice I have a link to the Milgram experiment. And this is a famous experiment. And I'll have you go watch that experiment. But it is an important example of people putting aside their own values and being obedient to someone they see in authority. And in some ways, you can see this as an example of slave morality. So it's not something that is natural. It's not human nature as much as it is a cultural phenomena or a millennia-long tradition of slave morality. So definitely go check out that Milgram experiment link that I have at the course website for Philosophy 313. And kind of be prepared to talk about that and relate it to slave morality and some of the issues that we've talked about with respect to Nietzsche. But I think this generally covers what I wanted to say about Nietzsche. There's many, many, many more things that can be said about Nietzsche, and some of that will be brought up on other aspects of the course and so on. But I think now it's time to move on to Camus. And Camus is often generally regarded as Nietzsche as one of those existentialist philosophers. And in the existentialism course, I will often teach Camus and Nietzsche, and they do very much belong together. So it's not a big stretch to move from Nietzsche to Camus, though they do have a different emphasis. And for Camus, as you can see right off the bat in the very beginning of the reading, Camus argues that the problem of suicide is the only philosophical problem. And the question then is, well, what is it about suicide that makes it a philosophical problem? And the answer is fairly simple. I mean, it's not a sociological problem, and it's not a physiological or biological problem. There are sociological problems and physiological problems. We could say that depression, for example, could be a physiological problem, lack of sunlight or lack of dopamine or whatever. And there are medicines and various medical treatments that one can initiate, go under a sun lamp, etc., to try to relieve the causes of depression. So that is one source of suicide, would be kind of as a medical problem, and one would then seek a type of medical solution. And then there's a kind of sociological problem. It's the pressures put on someone to achieve certain stature by a certain point in life, and the pressures that might lead to might result in certain sociological demographics having higher suicide rates than others, and one would study that from the perspective, why are this age group more likely to commit suicide than others, and study it from a kind of sociological perspective. That would be looking at suicide from uh, as a sociological problem. But as a philosophical problem, this gets to the point that I think I brought up a few lectures ago. If someone were to call a suicide hotline and they were contemplating suicide and were standing on a bridge, and you wouldn't, this was the Hume lecture, you wouldn't simply tell them certain facts about what would happen if they jumped off the bridge. And you wouldn't go on, well, yeah, it's not surprising you're doing that. You're in the age group that does that, or perhaps have you not taken your medicine today? In other words, you would not at that point engage in the medical or the sociological problem. What you would try to do is you would try to talk that person down. And the way you would do that, you would try to give that person a reason or a purpose to come down. And that's where Camus claims it becomes a philosophical problem, because the philosophical problem is having a reason or purpose to live and having a meaning in life. And this leads to Camus' most important concept in the writing, or at least in the writing that we have for this particular course, and that is the concept of the absurd. Because basically what Camus argues is that as the more we try to think about what the meaning of life is, the more we're unable to find a meaning. Now, granted, society and culture will tell us how to live our lives, what we ought to do, and so on and so forth. But the more we think about it, the more our thoughts undermine these established meanings and purposes. In the reading, Camus gives the example of an apartment manager whose daughter had passed away, and a few years after his daughter passed away, he committed suicide. And Camus talks about how his thoughts were undermining, and by undermining thoughts, he means that he began to think about his purpose and meaning of his life. And apparently his daughter was his purpose and meaning in life, and when she died, that meaning and purpose was taken away. And so he began to think, well, what is the meaning of my life then? And eventually he came to the conclusion that he had no meaning or purpose in his life, and as a result he committed suicide. So this leads Camus then to the question that is, well, what is it about this need for meaning and purpose that we have in life? And it apparently gives us a type of kind of either or. Either there is a need, either there is a meaning and purpose for life, or there isn't. And if there isn't, suicide's a viable option. And so therefore, if we don't want to commit suicide, we need to have a meaning and purpose for life. Get it? In other words, if there's no meaning or purpose for life, we might as well just cash it in now. This is not Camus' perspective. In fact, what he's going to argue is that a life without meaning and purpose is actually going to be a life more fully lived, a life lived with passion and intensity. In fact, what Camus is going to argue is that the person who's more opposite the suicide person is the condemned person, the person the night before their execution. And the reason for this is that they have no hope, meaning, or purpose left in their life. They only have the life right then, right there. And so that life right then, right there becomes all the more intense. I had an experience once. I was driving in Louisiana and nearly got into a head-on collision. It was 10 o'clock at night or something like that. And I noticed some lights on the interstate. This was I-10. And then I realized it was a car going the wrong way in the interstate. And I just barely got out of that car's way. And that was one of those moments where one realized how fragile life is. And for that period of time, I had a greater appreciation for life. And I think that's Camus' point, that as if part of what happens as a consequence of an established meaning or purpose for life is that this meaning or purpose is usually something held off into the future. You need to get a job, you need to get married, you need to have kids, you need to see your kids off to college, you need to achieve certain benchmarks in your career, you need to retire, and so on and so forth. All these meanings and purposes that guide our daily lives are off in the future somewhere, And it's the life we live right now in the present that is the life that we have. And we often don't appreciate the life we have now because it's been mortgaged for some future that isn't right now. And so this is where you can see Camus being influenced by Nietzsche. In other words, it's the emphasis is upon this life, and the emphasis is upon what is life affirming. And what's more life affirming is to recognize that life has no meaning or purpose. Right? That's when we truly affirm the life we have right here, right now, rather than the life we think it should be by some purpose that isn't right here, right now. And it's in this context where the myth of Sisyphus comes in. This is a famous Greek myth that Camus adopts to his own purposes. The myth is that Sisyphus had died, and his wife didn't perform the proper burial ritual. And so while he's down in Hades, the Greek gods grant him a pass so that he can go back up and punish his wife for not having been respectful enough after his death. Well, after he ends up back among the living in life, he decides he likes life too much to go back down to Hades, and so he goes AWOL. He's basically on the run, and eventually he gets caught, and they bring him back into Hades, and they give him a punishment. They say, okay, we'll let you have life, but you could only have life as long as you roll this stone up a hill, a stone that will roll right back down to the bottom of the hill right after you've rolled it up. So you can see what they're doing is that he can have life, but his life is going to have to be spent doing something meaningless and purposeless. In other words, it's pointless. I mean, why roll this stone up the hill when it's just going to roll right back down again? And but what Sisyphus does, though, is he embraces that as his life, and he's actually happy. As Camus ends the reading, he talks about how Sisyphus is actually happy, and he's doing it as if this is exactly the thing he wants to do. So in some way, you can see that this is Sisyphus's rebellion against those who feel that life has to have a meaning or purpose. And in fact, if you take away the meaning or purpose, then you can see that life is exactly as it ought to be, that the life we have now is the life we have, and we ought to embrace it. And that's a rebellion against the sense of meaning or purpose. And in some ways, a kind of an existential crisis comes up at a point in a person's life when they look at what they've been doing for 20 years, let's say, and they realize, my God, what have I been doing for 20 years? And they begin to see it as meaningless and without purpose. I've been shuffling papers for 20 years. Why? Those are the type of undermining thoughts that we spoke of earlier. But what Camus is arguing is that those only become undermining thoughts when one feels one needs to have a meaning or purpose. Part of Sisyphus's rebellion is to reject that and to affirm life regardless. That's kind of the absurd freedom that Camus talks about. We have the absurd freedom to embrace life even without meaning or purpose, despite the fact that it's absurd. And that's the absurd, right? We get to a point where we can't explain it. We can't explain life. It just is. It's absurd. There's no meaning or purpose for it. But if we act and come from that perspective, then we will have greater passion for this life. It won't be diluted or mortgaged for some future meaning or purpose that needs to be realized. It will be lived with more passion right here, right now, like the passion of a criminal the night before their execution, or the passion of someone who just had a near-death experience, who's really appreciating life right here, right now. And if one operates from that perspective, one becomes what Camus will call an absurd hero. And an absurd hero isn't someone like a superhero. It's someone who really embraces the life they have right now, lives it with passion, rebellion, and intensity. And Sisyphus is an example of someone who would be an absurd hero. And Camus wrote a novel, The Stranger, and Meursault, the main character of this novel, also is portrayed as an absurd hero. Now, how does this tie into ethics? Well, in one important respect, if life is all that we have right here, right now, then one of the things that we come to recognize is that much of the standards of value that we place on life really kind of dissolve. In other words, we tend to look at one life as being more valuable or meaningful than another. A president of the United States' life is more valuable than a janitor's life. Or one person who's a star and famous is more valuable and their life is more meaningful than my life as just a professor or your life as a student. But what Camus is arguing is that if we really operate and come from this perspective of this absurd hero and see life as just important in and of itself, then we would have the same respect and care for a janitor as we would have for anyone else. So a consequence of this approach for Camus is that we would be more embracing of life and be more hesitant to impose a kind of scale on one life being more valuable than another. This also has very important consequences for things like the death penalty, because life itself becomes almost an absolute value for Camus. And so the death penalty becomes a certain kind of scale or standard that we impose upon life. And so this would cause us to really have to think again about life and what we're doing in the context of our own society. So there's a number of important consequences of the myth of Sisyphus and Camus' notion of the absurd as they relate to ethics. Well, that's it for the final lecture of this course, and hope to see you in an actual face-to-face class at some point in time. Take care.